Well, good morning. It's a joy to be back together and to sing God's praises. And what a wonderful worship team we have and great songs. So thank you all. This morning, in conversation with Pastor Peter, the thought was to focus on one of the great small books of the Hebrew Scriptures of the Old Testament, the amazing story in the book of Ruth. In my Bible, it only takes 3 pages. So this is just, in a sense, a sliver of the great full literature of the Bible, and yet so full of wisdom and insight for us. So this morning, I'd like to share about 3 themes that I see in the book of Ruth that are good for us, that are very excellent lessons for all of us. One is a theme of faithfulness and faith, another theme of prayer action, and then thirdly, godly character. So we have faithfulness, prayer action, and godly character. If you would just say those 3 themes with me: faithfulness, prayer action, and godly character. Now, there are 3 characters in this story, very fascinating. And as you read it, you get at least a good mental image. We don't have photographs or paintings of them that we can rely on how they looked, but they were people of complex, rich, fascinating character. One is named Naomi, and her name means pleasant. And I suspect that most of her life that name fit. But the story starts where she's had a difficult experience, very difficult experience. And when she comes back after being away from Bethlehem for 10 years, when she comes back, she says, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara," which means bitter. So instead of being the pleasant person, she's the bitter person, according to herself, her own report. Now, the complex story, the very sad tragedy that this book opens with is that Naomi and her husband were very concerned about a famine that had hit their hometown, Bethlehem. This is about 1,200 years before Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And they decided to head off to another country. And they picked a country that was often an enemy of Israel. They picked going to Moab. Now, Moab shows up in a lot of different places in the Old Testament. There were battles between Israel and Moab, and even during the pilgrimage through the wilderness, much of that time was spent in a wilderness that was part of Moab. And people of Moab really didn't like the Israelites. They were taking up space. They were using some resources. And it was Moab, the king of Moab, that employed Balaam in that story in around Numbers 20 through 22, that employed Balaam to do curses against Israel. And Balaam was not part of Israel, was not a real follower of the living God. But nevertheless, when he tried to do curses to earn the money that he was given from the Moabites, instead, God made only blessings come out of his mouth. And so he was not satisfying the purposes of Moab. But the hatred between Moab and Israel was fairly well sustained during the pilgrimage through the wilderness and after that as well, when Israel settled in the Promised Land, basically right next door to Moab. So nevertheless, Naomi and her husband chose to move to Moab and try to make a living there, try to get food for themselves and their 2 sons. And shortly after the move, Naomi's husband dies, but the sons fall in love with Moabite women. And so they stay then. The family stays for about 10 years, but both sons die, so that the original 4 that went to Moab for relief from the famine, only Naomi is left, and 2 daughters-in-law who seem to love Naomi a lot. And when Naomi heads back to Bethlehem, hearing that things are better there now, and she's doesn't really have a future in Moab. Initially, both of her daughters-in-law, both of the wives of her deceased sons, head off with her down the road. And as they start off, Naomi is, very expressive about her disappointments and complaints against God. She says that God's fist has been hard on her. God has hurt her. So she's complaining to God and being very open about her anger and disappointments. And at the same time, the 2 daughters-in-law still seem to love her and even love her God. So that this image of a caring God that you could still be angry at when things don't go your way, follow your hopes and wishes. And this caring God was still vivid enough to these daughters-in-law that they were drawn. But one of them decided to go back to Moab, find her future there. But Ruth was deeply devoted. Ruth was the other daughter-in-law. And she says that she's just will always be with Naomi. Her family will be her family. Naomi's God will be her God. So that this attraction to God, the living God, helped to overcome the sadnesses. And Ruth is on a mission to find more about God and to grow in God. Now, one of the things that has often amazed me is the honesty of Scripture. We see it throughout the Psalms, certainly see it in Job, other places where within the Scriptures, people openly complain when they go through hardship, when they go through pain and suffering. And in many of these cases, you can really identify with their desire to complain. Religions usually teach people to be always nice to the gods. But in a deep way, our God is bigger than all the false gods in so many ways. First of all, he is the only living God. He's the only real God. He is the God who created all the universes. He is the vibrant, caring, loving God. And it's okay to complain. If you look through the Psalms, out of 150 Psalms, I think there are 30 Psalms where there are strong complaints. And these are published as part of our Bible to guide us. So it's okay to express our sincere feelings to God. In fact, the truth is, he already knows what those feelings are. Anyway, he's big enough to take it, and he loves us so much that he is not hurt by our complaints, but eager to help us through our rough times. I may have mentioned this before a few months ago, but to me, a fascinating story is about a friend of mine who was exchange professor at the University of Beijing. Now, I think a year and a half, 2 years ago. And the authorities there at the university asked him to come and teach ancient literature, which was one of his specializations, and specifically said he had to include Job. And when he asked why they, as atheists, officially atheist people, wanted Job taught, they said, because God treats Job so badly, it'll help reinforce our atheism for the students. Well, this professor is not an atheist and saw much more in Job, and so did the students. The students were amazed that Job could complain constantly, chapter after chapter after chapter of complaints, never cursing God, never cutting off from God, but very strongly complaining about his condition. And the students saw that this was a better life than what they had, because they couldn't say a word of complaint to the authorities at the university. They couldn't say a word of complaint about their government. Complaining was prohibited for them. So they understood Job as a hero, and that God was a very significant positive reference that Job could make these complaints. And then, of course, at the end of the story, Job meets God and is just healed and restored and set on a very prosperous and positive and hope-filled, grace-filled life. So what an amazing story. And here, God is not hurting Naomi for being angry. So Ruth is the Moabite woman that comes along, comes into Bethlehem, and they go back to Naomi's home there. They get the feeling that she's a foreign presence. Half the time when Ruth is mentioned in this brief story, she's mentioned 12 times, and I think it's half the times she's referenced as Ruth the Moabitess, even though it's referred to repeatedly. So the writer, guided by God, is reminding us consistently that this woman came from what was time and time again an enemy country. Now, a third important character is Boaz. His name means wise and strong. And if you are familiar with the temple that Solomon built for the Lord many years later, now probably 200 years or so later, that had a pillar, one of the main pillars, holding it up. And that was given a name, along with some of the other pillars were given names. And that name was Boaz, but probably not a reference to this important character in Ruth, but rather to this being a strong pillar. So the word Boaz references being wise and strong. And he was a mixed breed person. He was a biracial person, is a better way to say it. His mother was a Canaanite, a fairly famous Canaanite named Rahab, who had helped the spies that had come into Jericho and helped them escape when the king of Jericho was trying to trace them down. Got word of the spies from Israel before the Battle of Jericho, when by God's grace the walls of Jericho came tumbling down when the people marched and prayed and blew the trumpets and shouted God's praise. So his mother, Boaz's mother, was Rahab, a Canaanite woman. And by the way, she was a Canaanite that was very well informed about the history of Israel. She knew about a lot of the miracles of God's working in and through the leaders of Israel, including the plagues of Egypt, including the safe travel on dry ground, going across the Red Sea, and other miracles, so that she was moved by the story of Israel and understood that God could have his way in Israel taking over the promised land. And because of her very gracious protection of the spies and guidance for them to escape, then the spies themselves promised that they would protect her and her family, whoever would be living right there in that house, to mark the house with a ribbon, and so her life was saved, and she joined in the nation of Israel and married into Israel. Her husband was Solomon, not Solomon, but Solomon, similar sound, and they had children, one of whom was Boaz. Now, Boaz in spite of him being half Canaanite, half Jewish, was a leader in Bethlehem and a successful farmer. By the way, his mother Rahab, just to make it clear, his mother Rahab is praised in James chapter 2, verse 25, as a model. She showed that she was right with God by her actions. An amazing statement by James in James chapter 2, verse 25. In that hall of faith, of people of great faith that moved history, in Hebrews chapter 11, the author says that Rahab was not destroyed with the people of Jericho. They refused to obey God, but she was committed to God and obeying God's direction in her life. That's Hebrews 11:31. So she is referenced actually 3 times in the New Testament. Those two, great praise from James and great praise from the author of Hebrews, but also in the genealogy of Jesus, because Rahab was mother to Boaz. Boaz's son, Obed, was the grandfather of David and all of them in the line of Jesus. So then there's a baby at the end of the story whom the community decided to name Obed. And he was half Moabite, half 1/4 Canaanite, 1/4 Jewish. But the people in the community recognized that this was a special baby. Maybe everyone should always recognize every baby is special, but said some strong things about him and what his future would be. And with great praise for Ruth as well. So these are our main characters. Naomi means pleasant, but she and her husband thought there was a better future in an enemy country. Didn't work out that way for whatever diseases or violence. The husband of Naomi and her 2 sons died. After 10 years away, she comes back. And Ruth, one of her daughters-in-law, comes with her. Boaz plays a role in helping Ruth in her work to glean fields. Now, when they come back and Ruth and Naomi set up home, Ruth pretty quickly says, I need to go out and glean, because they're kind of a welfare system, part of the safety net for poor people was to allow them to clean up anything that harvesters left. And they had come back, Ruth and Naomi had come back at a time of the barley harvest. So there's a brief comment at the beginning of chapter 2 that Naomi had an excellent relative. The word is translated wealthy relative, but literally the word means excellent, virtuous, a person of virtuosity, of being the best in what he could do. And so it's being wealthy is a very positive thing. Being a person of virtuosity or excellence covers even more. And that's the word that is actually used there in the Hebrew. So it's mentioned, just kind of a thought there. And then the story begins with Ruth going out to find a good place to do some gleaning. And without the direction of Naomi or anyone else to find Boaz's field. Boaz hasn't been mentioned yet in the discussion between Ruth and Naomi. And so the text says, it so happened, like what this was just kind of out of the blue that Ruth ended up at Boaz's field. I suspect that Ruth was a smart young woman and probably walked down a few streets outside of Bethlehem, a few highways, maybe would be the way to put it, country roads, and observed how well they were kept, what kind of workers were doing their work before she picked where she was going to do gleaning. And maybe that's how she ended up in Boaz's field, or one of his fields, the text says, because apparently it fields other places too. And so it may have been partly her own wise selection. We don't know. And, when the text says, as it turns out, it was, by the way, that could be a kind of way of saying that God directed her unconsciously, perhaps, to go down the right road, the right country road, stop at the right field, feel at peace about it, step forward, and start joining with the other gleaners. And so we get to know a lot more about our characters. And what we see in our main characters is a deep sense of faithfulness and faith. Again, to remind you, faith in God, very strongly expressed by Ruth, even in chapter 1. These words, in fact, that Ruth spoke to Naomi, insisting that she had to go with her. Ruth says, where you live, I will live. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. And wherever you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. May the Lord punish me if I don't live up to this vow. I've done lots of weddings, and occasionally a couple will say, we want this verse of Ruth speaking to Naomi in the wedding. And I try to discourage them because it's about friendship and not directly about a wedding commitment, a marriage commitment. But people, it still, of course, does apply, because husband and wife should be deep friends in their courting and the rest of their lives too. So, but it is interesting that this is one passage that is very often come up over the years, where people say, that was just such a moving statement. That's how we feel toward one another, even though this was a case of two women who were committed to each other in a godly friendship, deep godly friendship. But this friendship, of course, was a faithfulness. Ruth, wasn't looking for Naomi's relatives to rescue them once they settled in. Ruth's attitude was, well, what can I do? Well, it's harvest time, a great opportunity to go out and do some gleaning behind the harvesters and have the resources, have the food to live. So on that first day, Ruth is working hard. The workers invite her to, take a drink of water once in a while, sit in the shelter out of the sun, and this is all before Boaz comes by, and he asks, who is she? And he's already heard about how nice Ruth has been. What an awesome daughter-in-law, acting really like a very devoted daughter. So Boaz comes up to Ruth and says the nicest things he'd heard he says, I've heard all about what you've done for Naomi, and we are so grateful that you're looking out for her. And then in this relationship, because of Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi, Boaz looks out for ways to especially bless her and help her to succeed. And in the hard work of Ruth on that first day, she collected, it says 20 quarts of food, or about, it's a ephah, some size of basket that would be around 20 quarts, or something I think we'd all better understand, 30 pounds. She collected 30 pounds of grain on that first day. So Ruth was working hard, and Boaz said, you don't have to go to any other field. We're going to treat you nicely here because of your great faithfulness to Naomi. And so come back here as long as the harvest goes on, and we'll give you food during the day, and we'll take good care of you. So the faithfulness of Ruth is crucial to the story. Now, the faithfulness of all of them to God is very powerful too. Naomi complained about God's dealings with her, but yet as they arrived, as good things happened, Naomi gave praise to God. She had not stopped talking with God, and I think that's crucial. And one way to be sure you keep talking with God is when you have nothing, when your soul feels so crushed that you can't say good things, or it's very hard. Go ahead and say what is really going on in your soul. Again, God already knows it anyway. Bring it into that relationship helps make that relationship with God real. And so Naomi's faith in God is a great theme throughout the 3 pages of Ruth. Certainly, Ruth's faithfulness to God. She is looking for God's guidance. She is responsive to people saying great things toward her as kinds of encouragement and empowerment, and doing it in the name of God. And Boaz is very faithful to God too, is very committed to God, blesses Ruth in the name of God right from the beginning. So the God relationship penetrates daily conversation for Naomi and Ruth and Boaz, as I believe it should, not in a cheap way or throwaway words, but really out of our heart, to be able to bless people, to thank God when good things happen, to seek God's healing and guidance when things go bad or even awful. So we have Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi and Ruth and Boaz faithful to God, and clearly God faithful to these 3 characters, while he's faithful to, of course, thousands and thousands of other people at the same time. But God's faithfulness to guide Ruth, however it was that guidance was expressed, to guide Ruth to probably the best field, or one of the best fields, since Boaz ran several fields. So God's faithfulness is there too. And faith and faithfulness go together. To be trusting God, we are faithful to God. God is faithful to us. When God entrusts us with opportunities, as he did for Naomi, and as he did entrust Ruth with opportunities, and in the end, as he did entrust Boaz with opportunity, even more opportunities. Therefore, in that entrustment, in that faith that God has, putting resources, opportunities, joys, relationships in our lives, placing those expressions of his grace into our lives, that faith that God expresses into our stewardship, into our opportunities. The best response is our faithfulness to God and fulfilling his purposes for those gifts, for those opportunities, for that grace, that we will be fully all that he desires. So faithfulness is one of the great themes of these 3 pages of the book of Ruth. Second theme we had mentioned earlier on was prayer action. Sometimes our prayers are disconnected with our actions. It seems to me, to take a common example, if we recite the Lord's Prayer silently or out loud in a service, before our service is over, when we speak the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, I believe God hears that as our vow to follow his guidance on earth as the angels follow his direction in heaven. So that prayers ought to help shape actions. Whatever is important enough to be brought up to God in a prayer, we ought to be ready as volunteers to help make it happen on earth, rather than just say some empty words and then it's like it really didn't matter to us in the beginning. If it really matters to us enough to bring up in a prayer, then it ought to matter to us when we have opportunity to be part of the answer that God will give for that prayer. A vivid example is at the very end of Matthew 9, Jesus says to his followers that were around him, we don't know how many people, think it might have been maybe 100 people were around him, when Jesus said to these followers, pray to the Lord of the harvest that he will send workers into his harvest, because the harvest is ripe. The very next verse, there happens to be a chapter break, but that wasn't there when Matthew wrote it. Chapter breaks were added hundreds of years later after Matthew wrote. So the next verse happens to be Matthew 10, verse 1, and that's where it starts. Jesus selecting the laborers for the harvest, selecting Peter and Andrew and James and John, so that the answer to Jesus' prayer that the Father would send laborers is in Jesus' mouth and already in his mind, and then expressed as the appointment of these initial 12 apostles. It's kind of like being at a committee meeting and you share a great idea, and then once the motion is passed to follow your idea, you're the one appointed as chairman of the project, or at least on the committee for the project. And you can't really get out of that because obviously it mattered to you, so that obviously you want to contribute some time and attention and skill to making it happen. So note this amazing prayer expressed in Ruth's presence in chapter 2, verse 12. Ruth 2:12. Easy to remember, boiling point in Fahrenheit temperature. So Ruth 2:12 says, Boaz says, may the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, may he reward you fully for what you have done. Coming to Israel as to have the Lord as her refuge, and of course what she had done, blessing Naomi. Now, so then he invites her to come sit down, have a little lunch, some roasted grain and bread that they were able to dip into sour wine, and to have a refreshing lunch. And then it says in verse 15, as Ruth went back to work, so maybe she's just getting up from eating, as she was getting up to go back to work, Boaz ordered his harvesters, let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her. In fact, pull out some of the heads of barley from the bundles that have already been made and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up and don't give her a hard time. Isn't that amazing? So Boaz prays a blessing on her for her to have success, obviously including getting food to take home. And then immediately after they all get up from lunch, he says to his workers, hey, you already bundled up all that grain? Pull some grain stalks out of that, some of the barley out of that. Just drop it on the ground and be a little less precise, a little less complete, I guess, in your collection of the barley. So there's more for Ruth to pick up. That's probably one of the reasons why she got 30 pounds of grain, not stalks of grain. she actually thrashed the grain before she took it home and to Naomi. And Naomi was deeply impressed that she had brought all this on just one day. And by the way, the food that was offered to her for lunch, she tucked some away in a pocket and brought that home for Naomi too. So the amazing devotion that she had to Naomi is multifaceted. Now, this prayer action, I hope you understand, to pray for something. And we can't stop but pray when we see something that needs to be fixed, changed, helped. And just to think of that as a commitment to action, as God wisely, gracefully guides our actions. You could call this heart-hand harmony. In sports or in computer games, people talk about eye-hand coordination. Well, this would be eye-heart coordination or eye-body coordination, because it takes more than just a heart commitment, but actual doing things. And think of Boaz's amazing gracefulness, modeling the grace of God in multiplying the resources available to Ruth. But Ruth still had to pick up the grain and thrash it, and then carry this sizable quantity of grain back to the home. So faithfulness matters. God's faithfulness to us, faithfulness of God to us, and demonstrated repeatedly in this short book, as well as the rest of Scripture, God's faithfulness certainly to Naomi and to Ruth and to Boaz. And then prayer action. Think of prayer as a kind of action that precedes other action. Or think of action always having to start with prayer. So we're recognizing God's role in anything that we seek to accomplish. So we have faithfulness, we have prayer action, and then godly character. We mentioned earlier that Boaz is referenced as an excellent person, a wise person, a person of virtuosity. And it's, to me, fascinating that after some days, we don't know how long, maybe a week or two, there are other conversations, of course, between Boaz and Ruth over this period of time. But in chapter 3, verse 11, after one nighttime conversation between Boaz and Ruth, Boaz says to her, as they're talking about working toward marriage, working toward also financial blessing for Naomi, don't worry about a thing, my daughter, Boaz says to Ruth. I will do what is necessary, for everyone in the town knows you're a virtuous woman. And that has its own wonderful connotations. You're a virtuous woman. But curiously, that's the same word in Hebrew that's translated that he was a wealthy businessman. And both times, the word is really a bigger word. And I think it's so awesome, this word excellence. He was an excellent businessman when Boaz is introduced in the first verse of chapter 2. And then Boaz says to Ruth, you are a woman of excellence. You're a woman who's not just virtuous. The word used means who has virtuosity. This word isn't used very often, but I love it. If someone becomes a master at the violin or piano or singing or other kinds of things that require great skill, the word used often in describing that person's performances is virtuosity. Like a complete, on every dimension, all the excellence just showed virtuosity. And I think it's a great word for us as we think about how to honor God more and more, to have virtuosity. Virtue, yes, of course, and we're not diminishing that. In fact, the virtue is all the more powerful if it's part of what's literally said here. You have virtuosity. If you'd like to know the word sounds like chayil. That is a vegetable, a green vegetable. It's often added to salads called kale. So it almost sounds like that, only the first syllable, you have to kind of clear your throat. So chayil, chayil, chayil. It's like Chayil. The Hebrew kind of transliterated into English. This excellence, so powerful, to really express the fullness of God's grace in every dimension of our lives, and to allow God to work, to nurture skills and use of opportunities and relationships. And of course, it takes our own devotion and commitment and concentration to succeed at becoming people of virtuosity, people of excellence. But let me encourage you to make that passion of yours, to be kind of like Boaz, and especially if you're in business. Virtuosity would surely include profitability in a very important way, but also Ruth with no resources, but nevertheless making good choices, showing her faithfulness to Naomi, caring for people, responsive to God and his directions in her life to the right field and to right way of talking with Boaz, and then to become the wife of Boaz. Now, we don't know whether Boaz was ever married before this. If you calculate the years in terms of how long after the fall of Jericho, and even giving Rahab a young age at the time, maybe a young woman around 20, and then thinking of when she might have had Boaz as a child, and then looking at Boaz's son, Boaz and Ruth's son, Obed, whose name meant worshiper, curiously, seeing Obed as someone that will serve God and worship in his life, and Obed's son Jesse and Jesse's son David. And we have a sense of when those events probably occurred. So the calculation is that Boaz may have been a senior citizen at this time. And maybe if he had been married, maybe his wife had passed away. But he was eligible, and there was within the tradition too a kind of responsibility to be sure that the married woman whose husband had died, Ruth, would have children. And of course, obviously, Boaz and Ruth had already hit it off for lots of good reasons. And God guided them to be married and to have one or more children, the first being Obed. So here we have godly character shown in these amazing people. And one way to think of godly character is in 4 dimensions, using Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require? So paying attention, but to do justice, so being fair in our life and our decision making and opportunities. Love mercy, not only being merciful to others, but to love doing it, not being a grumpy, merciful people, but to love mercy and to walk humbly with God. Walk humbly with God, really let God speak, making your prayer life at least 50% silence on your part, so that you can hear and feel God's spirit, God's guidance in your life. So let's look at our 2 main characters. Boaz, certainly aware, very alert. As soon as he saw a new person doing the gleaning, made his introduction and encouraged her and had already known what wonderful things she had already been doing for Naomi. He was keeping up with what's going on in the community. It didn't make his grain grow better, but that's who he was. So someone that was informed. And it was a man of justice. Yeah, did he do justice? Well, he was a man of his word. When he said he was going to do something, he did it. And when he prayed, he was immediately part of the answer to the prayer. That's an amazing act of justice. Merciful, caring for all the workers. He had provided for workers. And again, these were people that he didn't have an obligation to, other than the wonderful structural obligation to allow people to glean after the work of the harvesters had been completed in a row of grain. And then humbly accountable to God. Yes, he showed himself to be a responsible person who put people first. And his money didn't get in the way of his having a big heart for people, and obviously starting especially with family connections. He had inner strength. He had valor. He was a worthy person. He was a person of excellence. He had virtuosity. And these are part of being accountable to God. All of us get tons of opportunities, gifts, skills, different ways that God shows his grace, in addition to his amazing gift of forgiveness and the grace poured out to us through the blood of Christ shed at Calvary. And obviously, Boaz is a model of someone who helped that grace multiply through his relationships. And Ruth, too. I think she passes the test of these 4 dimensions of character. She was aware. She had fair and just relationships that she followed up with. She was a person of mercy and caring for others, shown especially in her relationship with Naomi, as it should be. And then accountable. She was a person of excellence. She was aware, in spite of Naomi's anger and bitterness and complaining, she had earlier seen Naomi in a joyful state, say at the wedding that where Ruth married one of Naomi's sons, and she never lost that. She saw the power of the living God. It's so different from the gods of the Moabites. Gods of the Moabites were just statues, and they were all, without getting into detail, all sex-oriented, male or female, where it's all was worship of female or male sexuality, and that was not, thank God, something that drew Ruth in. She was much more attracted to the God who is our Father, who wants the best for us in every dimension of life, and doesn't require the pollution of our relationships at all. And by the way, it doesn't require the sacrifice of babies, which the gods of the Moabites did. So she was drawn. She was aware. She saw the vibrant religion of Naomi and chose that. So she's aware. She's just. She was not pushy. She was not out of line at all in her relationships with Naomi or Boaz or anyone else in the text. Merciful, yeah. You're here, instead of completing the food given to her at lunch, she puts quite a bit of it in a pocket to bring home to Naomi. Now, Naomi probably had some food, but it was her way of expressing how she had been thinking of Naomi while she's working hard in the field to collect food for Naomi and for herself. And so her merciful attitude toward Naomi was very measurable, and very merciful in terms of reminding Boaz of So his family responsibilities, being part of that awakening process, but merciful. You could tell she was a loving, kind, caring person. And then accountable, uh, you know, just responsive to God's prompting for gleaning, for working hard, for following through with opportunities that were put in front of her by God and through God, through other people as well. And that's why Boaz was able to say to her, you have a reputation. Your reputation is excellence. You know, you're a virtuous woman, but you have excellence in the full sense of the person, not just in a particular part of behavior. You are a person of virtuosity of life. And may we all follow this wonderful kind of phrase to have chayil, this amazing gift from God to be excellent at anything that we do. The excellence meaning the best. Do the best that we can do, not to compare with anyone else. So may the Lord help us to learn from his word, including the deep lessons he gives us through the amazing model of Naomi, through the amazing model of Ruth, and through the amazing model of Boaz. It is curious. I was a bit humored by the way the story ends with the women in the community going to Naomi after the birth of Obed, and they're excited with her, and of course Naomi is helping to raise Obed, the child of Boaz and Ruth. And the people in the community, the women in the community say, Obed will make your life new again. He will take care of you when you get old. Well, that sounds great. And he is the son of your very own daughter-in-law. And she loves you. And then this is an amazing sentence. She is better to you than 7 sons. Well, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but it was the way the community saw the devotion, the accountability of Ruth toward Naomi and toward God. That she could measure up to even what 7 sons could do. So may these vivid images from this great story guide us, fill us, and lead us in a great path going forward as well. Lord Jesus, we thank you for your amazing love. Thank you for sharing this extraordinary piece of literature that so reveals you, as well as wonderful models for us of Naomi and of Ruth and of Boaz. May our lives be enriched by their models, their exemplary living to be more free, more real, more honest, more loving and accountable and fair in all our relationships. May we truly serve you in even new ways going forward because of this great Bible text of Ruth. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.